welcome today to the webinar, and thank you for joining us. I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer here at Orthogonal. I want to welcome you here on behalf of myself and our co-host, Bernhard Kappa, CEO of Orthogonal, and Arna Nascu-Stoll, CEO of Wavely Health. This is a part of a monthly webinar series we've been doing called Move Faster and Break Nothing, which is all about how do we accelerate the development of medical devices and specifically software-enabled medical devices while still protecting safety and making sure that medical devices are working as intended. The topics we've been doing so far in this webinar series are really more horizontal topics, things around incorporating Agile or incorporating a dynamic data-driven EQMS. And this is our first webinar. I would say it's more of a vertical topic where we're picking a specific clinical domain. In this case, it's a emerging new class of software-driven therapeutics that we think is really exciting and pretty new, so there's a lot to explore. So first of all, we'd love your feedback on this webinar and on future ones. Feel free to email us or send us in chat. If you have questions as you go, love to hear those as well. Our goal for you today is to walk away with a good overview of CDCE, Clinical Diagnostics on Consumer Electronics, have some gold nuggets about this, and let you think about how to start using it in your job. We'll welcome questions, we'll take them at the end. So what we've promised is we'll get you all in and out by 50 minutes after 10:02. Core discussion will be done by then, will be to answer questions. However, what we've generally found with these webinars, there are a lot of questions. So we will actually stay around for a full 90 minutes on this webinar to answer questions. And we've generally gone pretty close to that or frequently close to that. So that's the core of it. Why don't I ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves today. Let's start with our co-organizer, Erna.
Hi, thanks so much. Very excited to be here today. Excited to dive into a conversation about this new emerging industry, which I think is very much going to become a part of the future of healthcare. I think we were just talking earlier how many smartphones there are in the world, using the 6 billion smartphones that are already in the world, and turning all of those into a potential medical device is a pretty powerful shift in the medical ecosystem. And so at Wavely, we're excited to be a part of that. What we're doing at Wavely is solving for the problem of really not being able to do pediatrics over telehealth. Kids are very non-specific in their symptom descriptions. My girls, for example, will only tell me they have a tummy ache. They could have a broken leg in the backyard. They'll tell me they have a tummy ache. And so what that means is you really can't easily do pediatrics in a virtual setting. And so pediatrics is highly reliant on physical exams, on diagnostics, and today you have to schlep your child into the doctor. But what we're doing is creating a platform of smartphone-based diagnostics focused on unlocking the key physical exams that have to occur in the pediatric space in order to be able to do those visits in a virtual context as opposed to having to go into the doctor. So we have a roadmap that will basically enable 69% of acute pediatric visits to shift into the virtual space. And we're starting with ear infections, which is the main reason kids go to the doctor. And we have an app that delivers the key physical exam finding for an ear infection so that the full assessment can happen virtually with a physician as opposed to in the office. So that's what we're doing. And I think, at any time you're at the emergence of a new industry sector, there's a lot to work through, and I'm excited to dive into those topics today.
Great. That would qualify all under very cool. We have Bernhard Kappa, CEO of Orthogonal. Bernhard, could you quickly introduce yourself and talk about kind of why we pushed you on this panel?
Yeah, hi. So, Orthogonal develops SEMD for startups and large medical device companies, and of late also for pharma firms. And we've noticed this trend a couple of years ago for, digital screening and digital diagnostics. We've been involved in a few of these, and we've been very excited about this space for, I think, some of the reasons that Arna mentioned, really the ability to distribute on all of these commercial platforms, as you say, 3 to 6 billion smartphones out there, and then integrate these in with other emerging or growing areas like telehealth, hospital at home, in clinical trials, et cetera. And I think there are a lot of interesting, both technical but business model challenges there. So we're excited to bring this area forward and wrestle with some of those challenges, some of which are general to SAMD, but some of which are really specific to this area.
Excellent. And then we have two Mike or Michaels here. I think we will refer to them probably in the as Michael and or Mike and Dr. Michael, but I realize we could also just an Australian Mike and Miami Mike, but that's probably a little too informal here. I don't think I know them well enough. So let's have Mike Connell introduce himself, please.
Great, thanks, Randy. So yes, this is Aussie Mike Connell. So I'm with ResApp Health. I head up commercial here with ResApp. And as of the end of September, we're now a part of Pfizer. So really excited about that. And I think, to some of the points the panelists have already made, it speaks to the validity of using software as a medical device as a way to take consumer devices and really bring diagnostic tools to large-scale populations. As Anna mentioned, there's roughly 6 billion smartphones in the world. So, what an exciting opportunity to really make health far more accessible and scalable than what it is for many people in the world today. We specialize in respiratory disease. And when you think about it, at any one point in time, there's roughly about 1 billion people around the world with either chronic or acute respiratory disease. So when you think of that in the context of health systems and clinicians needing to manage that respiratory disease, there's not really sufficient resources in the world, and hence being able to really scale things to deliver more diagnostic insights, more patient monitoring opportunities, to provide more ways that patients can engage their own health and inform what their clinicians are doing in terms of the management of those people, I think just makes everything much more accessible. I really do like the health equity play that smartphones and smartwatches can provide from a health perspective. So I do think this is a really exciting space to be playing in. From a ResApp perspective, a little bit similar to Anna, what we're trying to do is deal with, at least remotely initially, some of the most common reasons why people go to see a doctor or present in an emergency department. And that's really for respiratory disease. It's one of the top 3 causes of a hospital admission and one of the most frequent reasons for someone attending a primary care clinic. And we provide an aid to the diagnosis of diseases like pneumonia and asthma exacerbation, COPD exacerbation, and from a kid's perspective, diseases like croup, bronchiolitis, pneumonia. And again, that ability to scale that and bring the technology to where people are, we think is incredibly powerful. So very excited to be on the panel today. Thank you.
All right, terrific. And Dr. Michael Mina, sorry.
Mina's good. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Mina. I'm the Chief Science Officer at EMED. I'm an epidemiologist and immunologist, previous professor at Harvard, and also a clinical pathologist in molecular virology diagnostics. EMED is very complementary to, in particular, to Wavely and ResApp. Just heard from what EMED is doing is trying to create an ecosystem that brings all of these new digital diagnostic clinical decision support tools on consumer electronics, and then also biological assays like the coronavirus rapid antigen test that we've all seen throughout this pandemic, and a whole slew of other products to package them up and start creating first aid kits for urgent care, if you will, something that people can have in their cupboards, and kind of takes away all the Googling that people are currently doing to try to find virtual care and telehealth, and tries to take some elements of the virtual care space, putting it into the physical space in kits like boxes that then give them access to the tools and the virtual care that they're going to need. So that's kind of the product line and product roadmap that's very much in line with sort of the basic core technologies that we'll probably hear about. And then we have sort of a scientific arm that's building out new digital diagnostics as well.
Wow. Terrific. So this is a great lineup. We have two early pioneers in CDCE. One expert who spent a lot of time with the startup thinking about how to revolutionize where we deliver diagnostics and how we deliver them, including CDCE, but also other kinds that are being adapted for the home. And one person who can talk a lot about software as a medical device and how SAMD and software and smartphones are eating the medical device space. So between all of you, I think we got a good plan. Why don't we start with a little definitional level setting, since we just invented the expression CDCE, Clinical Diagnostics and Consumer Electronics, 3 weeks ago, I think. And we'll see if it sticks, but we're shooting for it. If you have a better one, let us. What is CDCE? What distinguishes it from other kinds of diagnostics? How is it done? And particularly, if you could talk about what are the diagnostic platforms for it, and what are the sensors in those platforms that are being used?
I can start off. So if you think about digital therapeutics, which are essentially, therapeutics that are delivered without chemistry, there's a number of them that are now FDA approved. I think CDCE or digital diagnostics are the corollary for diagnostics. So it's basically software or only diagnostics, which is quite powerful because it means you can scale immediately at the snap of a finger. Nearly all medical devices, medical diagnostics require hardware that is very expensive for companies to ramp up, has major distribution barriers. And with CDCE or digital diagnostics, you instantly have them available on your phone since they're software only. I think most of the ones we're seeing today are smartphone based. I think we are going to start seeing watch based, and there's some teams working on home speaker based diagnostics, which is quite interesting. I think tablets are there's a few that are on tablets as well, and I think we'll see more of that. So I think it really is pretty exciting to be able to create basically diagnostic devices that have no hardware.
And my view of this is, if we think about
and what are the
Sorry, Randy, I think you're breaking up. I think Michael was, yeah.
Yeah, so the way that I think of clinical diagnostics on consumer electronics is we all have these smartphones, whether it's smartphones, tablets, or even things like laptops and speakers with microphones in them. The way that a doctor operates and the way that laboratories as well operate is through extensions. Really, historically, it's been the development of new tools that improve the senses of a physician, if you will. And maybe that's through training to hear certain heart rhythms. Maybe it's through a doctor learning to understand what somebody's cough might sound like, or looking into somebody's ear. And essentially what consumer electronics are bringing us, now that we all have these things almost literally attached to us, and pretty soon they will be truly attached to us, is they offer this massively powerful additional set of sensors that just become extensions of us and augment, if you're not a physician, they augment our ability to look inside of our child's ear and understand if they have an ear infection, just by using the additional sort of power of both AI and the sensors that are being massively built into these phones now. And in many ways, the average sensor on a phone or a device is better than the average clinical diagnostic tool instrumentation that's really state of the art right now in clinical practices. So, when you then augment that even further with additional things that will stick into the USB-C ports of a mobile phone, for example, all of a sudden you have this whole array of sensors that really start to emulate, the computational power and biological power that you'd see in a modern day laboratory or clinic. And packaging all of that sensing power and even the interpretation through AI and machine learning into these devices is really, I think, that's where this whole consumer electronics being used for clinical diagnostics is really kind of taking it's really pushing forward.
So this is one of these things where the multi-$100 smartphone in your pocket, or potentially, in some parts of the world, a $50 smartphone in your pocket is just as powerful as $10 million worth of lab gear.
Well, maybe if I can.
All right. Could one other topic to address, could somebody please enumerate?
Sorry, I was just going to say to that point. So at ResApp, we're analyzing respiratory sounds to diagnose respiratory disease. And, if you think about exactly the point you've just made, our initial research was done back around 2013, 2014. And even back then, the initial way that we recorded those sounds was using, a super high quality, studio quality microphone. And after we did the initial kind of proof of concept, our CEO challenged our key inventor, Dr. Yudantha Abaratney, to compare how good that sound recording was versus even a simple iPhone 4 or 5. So this is many years ago now. And there was nearly no difference really in the quality of the recordings that you could achieve with an iPhone 4 back then compared to a studio kind of microphone. And now you kind of think about all the ways the microphones and the other sensors have developed. I just think it gives us enormous potential for creative scientists and inventors to find new ways to use how smartphones are evolving to create more diagnostic aids.
I would add to that, right? There's, I think they are getting so much better so quickly, right? All of Moore's law, not just applied to computing, but to how powerful the cameras are, and to how fast, transmissions are, et cetera, is all playing a part here. Computer vision is probably one of the bigger areas with a lot of potential. So many different things you can look at, both, individual points, but also you can measure more frequently than you could if you had to go and do a lab test or something like that. So everything, looking at faces, looking at eyes, looking at the skin, looking at the throat, all of these things that you can look at and potentially find biomarkers, find things, is pretty incredible.
I apologize. My internet's been a little choppy. Hopefully it's fixed. If not, I'm just going to go silent and Bernhard will take over. So as we talk about how much we can count on computers for diagnosis, I've got 3 or 4 devices up and 3 different internet connections, and yet I can't seem to get one of them working well right now. So just wave your hand and stop me if the quality is not good. So could you give a couple examples of CDCE, different companies trying different things? What sensors? What are we diagnosing? What's kind of a good range? What's happening right now?
I think so. There's a whole slew of different technologies that are being developed. I mean, you have 2, in my view, 2 of the sort of very innovative and different kind of approaches through both ResApp and Wavely here. So Wavely has, I'll let, of course, Arna talk more about it, but that's really combining both a consumer electronic, and it also requires a very inexpensive, essentially, piece of cardboard or sort of almost otoscope kind of thing that's going to go onto a phone. So it really couples a physical piece that needs to augment the digital electronic device itself. And then you have ResApp, which is fully taking a biosample through a cough and putting it right into the device for machine learning algorithms to interpret. There are a huge array of other companies that I think, when I think of how we're using consumer electronics in this space, it's going to be coupled, is a lateral flow rapid antigen test. How we have BD, Becton Dickinson has partnered with Scanwell, or acquired Scanwell, to essentially interpret the lines. And so that was a very innovative approach where you have a biological assay being delivered into the home without any instructions for use, purely through an app, and not even asking the person to do the interpretation themselves, but actually having them scan an image and having an AI reader essentially read the line. At eMed, what we've done is something a little bit different still, which is augmenting all of that with human telehealth proctors and utilizing telehealth proctors to also walk people through. And I view all of that as kind of all leveraging the fact that we're in an interconnected world with our consumer electronics, and some of it's doing the computation right there on the phone. some of it's doing it in the cloud, and some of it's even using proctors and real life people to augment all of that. So I think that those three or four examples kind of reflect one scope of where these devices are.
Yeah, it's kind of really just limited by what are the sensors you have available. And sometimes you can use multiple types of sensors as well. I think one of the areas where I see potentially a lot of promise is around in mental health. So I know of one early stage company that is using keyboard activity to basically, on the smartphone to feed into an AI algorithm and do screening for bipolar disorder out of that. And another one that sends, has people do daily or weekly, responses to questions where they're recording the response, both video and audio, and then again there's an AI algorithm that is looking for particular signals and screening, and then providing that screening to the psychiatrists that are working with them. So it's not just in this case the keyboard activity, and really how they're using the phone can be used. Just the haptics and what they're doing, you can think of that as a set of sensors as well as the things you would normally think of: microphone, accelerometer, camera, etc. There is another company that is using both the camera as well as the backlight, and a company called Biospectal. You put your finger on the camera lens with a light showing through, and they can monitor various vital signs in that way, and have a number of things in process in that regard. So there's it's kind of all over the place in terms of the areas where you can apply this. It is really just what is your imagination, and what could you think about with those sensors?
Yeah, I think
So
there's a couple of categories here that are really emerging where companies are clustering. I think one is neuro. And as Bernhard just mentioned, I think there are quite a few in the mental health space. Use the byproducts of your phone to identify biomarker, like digital biomarkers of various mental illnesses. There's also in neuro, I'd also put the companies that are looking at autism diagnosis. There's a couple of those. So I think neuro is one big category. I think the next big category is skin, which also I think emerged pretty early on, basically using the camera and machine learning classifiers to identify what's going on either with a rash or a wound. I think the next big category is heart and lungs. Companies looking at using various techniques, either active sonar generated by the phone or microphone sounds that are picked up by the phone to understand kind of what's happening with the heart and lungs, like with the cardiovascular and respiratory within the company, within the body. And then there's kind of an other category, like, we're focused, for example, on the ear, and there isn't really anybody else focused on that right now. But there are definitely like main systems of the body that companies are clustering around that I think are some of the low-hanging fruit. And I think, we haven't really talked about the evolution. We've talked about the sensors that have been on the phones for the last, 10 years, getting better and better and more sensitive, like the camera and the speaker. But there are new sensors getting integrated into phones. Like LiDAR is new as of the 10, I think, the iPhone 10. And
could you explain what LiDAR is briefly?
It's basically it's like a laser. It sounds it's a way to do a topographical map using your smartphone, and the new iPhones since the 10 use those to do a topographical map of your face for Face ID. But I think there's huge applications in terms of inflammation and orthopedics in terms of using LiDAR, and we haven't even cracked that bubble yet.
And LiDAR is the same technology that like Google and everybody who's doing mapping of streets has those huge things on their roofs using some of that technology, right? Okay. So I'd like to point out that we're 28 minutes in, and now I think we've established what CDCE is. And in 10 years, if we go back and think about the fact that it took us 28 minutes to explain this, it's going to seem so quaint that we had to explain to somebody how you could use sensors in your phone to do this. So I look forward to that. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges, and I'd like to jump over to Mike Connell, because you very successfully convinced a very credible player in healthcare and life sciences to buy you. How did you prove out the idea that you can just use your off-the-shelf smartphone or any off-the-shelf smartphone to do anything that's clinical grade? That you have the quality, in terms of the variety of the hardware, or how users do it? How do you know that it's sort of clinical grade or FDA grade with this stuff?
Yeah, great. So look, for us, we already have the CE mark on all three of our products. So we have three products: ResApp DX for diagnosing acute respiratory disease, like I've mentioned. We have a cough counter product that counts coughs, and we have a screening tool for obstructive sleep apnea. So three different applications. And we achieved the CE mark on those a couple of years ago now. And then earlier this year, we achieved our first FDA clearance on the obstructive sleep apnea product. So, that clearly is a cornerstone, is achieving the regulatory approvals. I guess what leads to that, obviously, is a lot of rigor in terms of the clinical development work, getting the right clinical advice along the way, all the quality systems that go into it, and making sure that you can validate and demonstrate to regulators that you can validate how robust your technology is, and that we know what we're actually doing and diagnosing, and how we can validate that through the process. And we've talked about how quickly phones are developing. One of the challenges associated with this is not all smartphones are as good as each other. So the quality of the microphones or the cameras may vary substantially. So you need to have really robust quality systems in place and ways to validate that your phone is actually doing what it is intended to do, your application, on all these different types of phones. And, that is an ongoing challenge, is range of devices that you can operate on.
Can you talk about that a little bit in the context of, we've talked about global health and sort of deploying in OECD countries versus deploying for, the developing world? How do you do that then? If what you have in some countries is the cheapest Android models, Can you still do clinical grade stuff?
Look, our process at the moment, we go through a very, very rigorous process to validate individual phones, which, it's a little bit of a long and arduous process, but that's the way we can be sure that, one of the cheaper phones, as you're saying, in the developing world can deliver the application in a way that it was intended to, and that we're confident in those outcomes. So we have a validation process that does that. We're also working on new generations of our algorithms that will be smarter, that can work on the majority of phones, and will kind of self-validate as we go, so you can build scale more easily. Because obviously the other thing that is happening, there's a proliferation of phone models and phone suppliers, and the traditional Apple, Samsung relationship of dominating the world for probably the last 10 years is starting to shift a bit. So there are a whole heap of new suppliers with different quality phones for different particular markets. So yeah, we do have a very robust quality and regulatory process to do that currently, and looking to do further development.
Yeah, I would say one thing around this that is, it is a challenge, right? Is if you think about the number of device profiles that are here, so basically the combination of smartphone, model, and operating system, even in the US, we're talking about, growing from 8,000 5 to 10 years ago to over 13,000 now. Now, not evenly distributed, obviously, but if you go worldwide, it is even more so, and you need to keep up with all of that. So you need to really carefully think about your strategies for how you do that, not just, when you're first getting something cleared, but how do you do that as you get new smartphone models out there. So there are things obviously you can do in terms of investing in a testing infrastructure for those things, but there is also in some cases, if you can think about field level self-validation when you have a new model, and then having that play with your whitelist, blacklist, gray list, feeding back in, that's kind of the process that you may be able to use and not, have a bank of 5,000 phones, which no one is really going to do in terms of that. But it's carefully thinking about that and thinking about where the risks are in your device.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to point out is that the good thing is that cell phones have actually changed very little. And the reason for that is because their fundamental structure works. So for example, pretty much every phone on the market has a speaker and a microphone on the bottom edge. And if you think about it, that's because of how you use your phone, right? If you hold your phone, it's like that. If you put it to your face, you cover that face. If you put it on the table, you cover the back. So really the only face you could guarantee is always going to be open to receive signals. Sound is going to be that bottom edge. And so like on pretty much every phone, we conducted a taxonomy of every phone that's been launched on the US market, I think since 2012. And out of all of them, there were only 2 models that did not have the speaker and the microphone on the bottom edge. They had it on the back, and lo and behold, their market penetration is almost nothing, and they're no longer around, right? So it is a good thing that we've basically landed on a form factor and on kind of an integration of sensors that has changed very little, because it is working. And so that does help kind of with consistency, kind of device to device worldwide.
I think on the camera front, right, there have been continue to be changes for the better. Both, you have a front camera and a back camera. Both of those cameras have been getting better, but for certain types of things, it is much more convenient to use the less powerful front camera, so you can, make sure you see what you're doing, or otherwise you have to use, video capture or capturing a bunch of things. If you have to use the back camera, there can be usability challenges around that as well.
In terms of the regulatory, we touched on a bit. I mean, does all of this have to be approved by the FDA or a national regulator in some country, or some of this sort of below that radar? How does that work?
So the regulatory landscape of all this is I would say it's in its infancy. Some of it needs to be fully FDA authorized, cleared, or approved with full clinical trials that support those clearances, usually through the 510(k) process. In the case of COVID, obviously, it's often been through the EUA process. But then there are also other approaches. A lot of devices and approaches are technically in what the category of being exempt, which doesn't mean that there's no regulatory authority over it, but it just generally means that the FDA will take a slightly different approach when evaluating it, and they won't require pre-market clearance in the same robust fashion. But ultimately, I mean, I think even products that don't need to go to the FDA, you don't want to be using your patients as your guinea pigs, and if people are using it. So I think any company that I've spoken to, certainly in this space, is, even if they're not necessarily regulated by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, they are generally doing everything they can to effectively, serve as though they would be. They're carrying out clinical studies, usually with independent academic partners. Oftentimes, if you can take it, even if you're not technically regulated as and you're really in the clinical decision support area, and it's not a full-on diagnostic unto itself, you're still going to want physicians and the average person alike to feel very confident. So, but in general, the rules are kind of being written right now in the agency, and I think the next 10 years we'll probably see software as a medical device and the standards around all these clinical decisions, these clinical diagnostics on consumer products. We're just going to see a whole new approach at the FDA to regulate these. Obviously, that's the agency is kind of a big ship that's slow to turn, but once it starts going, it goes.
So that's actually a great segue. So you've kind of talked about change management with the regulators. And I would anticipate CDCE, like any good technology, everybody will just inherently know how to use it, and there will be no resistance, and everything will just flow because we live in a tech utopia. Said no one ever. So let's talk about what is it? What are the changes that are going to be there for families, patients, consumers, providers, at hospitals, and doctor who's ordering these things. Also, if you could explore a little bit the topic of what do these things do? Do they give you a definitive diagnosis? You can go get a therapeutic based on that. You say, oh, you've got an ear infection, and the system just tells you that, and you can auto get prescribed, or is it giving information to a doctor? How does all that work? What's that change look like?
So I just want to jump in really quick with a plug for human-centered design, which is really the core of where I started my career and what has guided a lot of my career. I think human-centered design is going to become critically important as we put diagnostics into people's pockets broadly, as we bring these tools out into the world. I think in terms of families, the process of human-centered design is essentially to work very, very closely with your intended end users to end up with a product that is highly usable for them and highly desirable for them. It's basically, how do you get to the right solution? Before you even start building, how do you make sure that you're building the right thing? And then when you're building, how do you make sure that you build the thing right? And human-centered design gives you those tools. And I think it's critically important in this space for two reasons. Number one, we want to democratize access to these tools. So basically, if you want something that anybody can pull out their phone and use, you've got to use really, really great human-centered design processes to make sure that they can use them. And number two, if you want to build a tool that will be systemically adopted in the healthcare space, then you've got to use human-centered design principles to fundamentally understand how it is that you can integrate seamlessly into the workflows that are existing within the healthcare space, or which are the workflows that you have the opportunity to disrupt. If you just kind of sit in an office and come up with a plan and then try to launch it in the world, you're pretty much going to fail, especially when it comes to trying to shift the way people in the healthcare industry, which is a pretty entrenched industry, tend to do things. And so I think my plug right now is that the tools that we need to be using more than anything in this space are those offered by human-centered design, so that we make sure people can use them, and we make sure that we understand exactly how to integrate them into the systems we have.
Great. I would say, Arna and Mike Connell, if the two of you, maybe could you give any examples of counterintuitive learnings you had when you listened to the users, the patients, and the providers, in terms of how you shaped what you would have thought the diagnostic was going to be like and what it ended up being like?
I mean, I have a really quick story, Mike, while you're thinking of one.
Sure.
So so one of the things that we saw as we were watching parents and children, and also that I experienced myself with young kids, is that kids are just fascinated by their parents' cell phones. And there's actually something really exciting to kids to be able to use the cell phone to, in our case, play a bird chirp in the ear so that we can interrogate for middle ear fluid. And so what we did is, in order to get the child really excited and really compliant and really wanting to be involved in the test, we actually designed the app so that there's basically one big, huge button in the middle of the screen. And then if you basically offer the child the opportunity to be to press that button, when you can touch mom or dad's phone as a 4-year-old, there's nothing better in the world, all ills have been solved. And so basically we have the child actually initiate the test with that huge button that's easy to press, and they get very excited and very compliant with the test. And so that's an example of how we worked on that dynamic between the parent. We leveraged that dynamic between the parent and the child to really make sure that we deliver a test that's going to work in the wild in that context of the child who's perhaps a bit cranky.
Love that example, Anna. I think for us, probably not so much counterintuitive, but I think just, remembering the complexities of what you're doing here. So prior to ResApp Health, one of my key experiences was 10 years in pharmaceuticals, right? So when you're in that environment and you're thinking about bringing a new medicine to market, you've got a lot of clinicians to engage, and you've got payers and regulators, etc. But once you're actually in launch mode, it's really very much clinically directed. And sure, there's some oversights from some other areas. But if you think about implementing with a telehealth provider or with a hospital in an ED setting or something like that, it's not just the clinicians. You've got to have the IT department on board. You know, there's change management that's required, and how these reports are interacting with electronic health records and other systems like that. There's a lot more integration considerations and change behavior that you really need to do through the process. That's probably, to be fair, probably a lot more complex and convoluted than what I probably anticipated coming in.
I would go ahead.
Well, one very interesting initially unintuitive thing that we found as we rolled out our first sort of virtual care product, which was coupling the Abbott Binax Now test to telehealth and proctoring to guide people through it. We tested initially. We have all these proctors who walk people through and connect them to telehealth eventually. The most interesting aspect of that set of studies that we did was we initially had the individual, the patient, talking face-to-face over the phone with a telehealth proctor to get the guidance. What we found was that when you include an actual person as part of your digital diagnostics process, the patient doesn't actually want to see the proctor or the other person on the other end, even if it's a clinician. People are much more comfortable when using these devices looking at themselves, because we do it all the time on FaceTime and things like that. And we found that when we took away the two-way facing video and just made it a reflection of yourself, and when the other person on the other end speaks, we just have kind of like a little icon of a sound, that made people much more comfortable with the whole process. And so the learning there, people are comfortable looking at themselves, even if it's just on camera in their phone. And it's a learning as we look at how to incorporate other devices into these.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of these things that through human-centered design, through observing patients, you can get, but still to some extent what you're doing is probably maybe a little bit of a simulated environment. Maybe they're real environments, but it's not going to be everything. You're not going to be able to capture all the environments that you're going to be in, which is where I'd put the plug in for product analytics, right? So really, one of the things you can do, because it's a mobile app or it's digitally enabled, is you can capture information that if this were a traditional medical device would probably be very expensive and laborious to capture. You can understand how people are using your app, and you can see that in real time with product analytics, de-identified and with appropriate controls on it. But you can then see how those things are being used. So you have quantitative data, and then you can use that to feed back into your qualitative 3 User Thursday type human factors. Why and how are we going to make changes based on that, and then feed that into your canary tests or other, however your testing changes to your applications. So it's very powerful and something that, if you're used to things outside of the medical device space, is how things are done in the digital space. But I think it's still relatively new for medical device folks to think that way.
We're going to extend this webinar like 5 or 6 hours to peel through all these topics. So one thing that came up in some of our prior discussions that sort of, two interrelated things, is that diagnostics, I would think, would say, oh, the strep test, 1 line or 2 lines. It's a fairly binary thing. But in fact, some of what you all shared was 2 things. One was that you need to think a little more on a spectrum about what you're testing and how good the results need to be. And then the other one on the spectrum is that Arne, I believe you raised, was how do you explain to patients the statistical probabilities of false positives and false negatives? The radiology is the receiver operating curve, sensitivity and specificity. So could you talk about sort of the spectrum of what does a diagnostic actually need to be able to tell you, and then how do you deal with ambiguity?
So I'm actually going to defer this question to Dr. Minna because he's an epidemiologist and also an MD. And I think this is the absolute perfect question for him. And I would love to hear his answer.
Well, in general, I mean, the way that these tests are being utilized has to be first front and center of what we're actually determining are the metrics that are going to be used. The sensitivity and specificity, despite kind of the textbook idea of it, it's actually not a binary kind of yes/no answer for a lot of things. What exactly it is you're trying to detect, should be driven by what's the indication for use, and that overall should drive how you then go and measure how well these products are actually operating in the field for their given intended use. So a great example, is a rapid antigen test. It's something I've spoken a tremendous amount about over the last couple of years. They're very boring tests. They're very powerful. But the interesting thing is, while they have been seen as low sensitivity to detect the virus relative to PCR, they're actually extremely high sensitivity for identifying infectious people. And although they've been described as low specificity relative to molecular PCR tests, they're actually much, much, much more specific than a PCR test when your goal is to identify infectious people and not just people with remnant RNA. So I just use that as an example that each of these different diagnostics, we have to kind of always start with what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish. Company like ResApp has an awesome product. Obviously Pfizer thinks so too. And the really interesting thing about that is it's really, really great for some things, and there are other things that it might be like, well, costs can only go so far. But if your intended use is like, I'll just throw an example. I don't know how it's actually functioning this way, but if your intended use is to identify bacterial versus viral infections, something massively important in the virtual care and telehealth space and just medicine in general, if they can do that, even if it can't distinguish two different SARS-CoV-2 variants from each other, that is a massively, massively powerful tool to put into a smartphone. So I think always falling back on what is it we're trying to do, and then identifying where specificity and sensitivity come in, and that needs to be what's driving sort of all of these. But ultimately, the studies and what we require of them is, the level of integrity of the device and the accuracy is going to be very similar to what we're used to in the clinical laboratory space.
I think
so. Don't forget that it's not perfect right now in the old school lab.
I just wanted to add a bit about the user perspective, which I think is important, right? Because I think Dr. Minna has laid out the broad outline and kind of the broad meaning really clearly. So from the user perspective, one of the things that was interesting to us is our initial version of the app, it was actually telling patients, like, we provide now a binary, you've got fluid likely or unlikely in your ear. And the initial version of our app was actually giving you a percentage of how likely or unlikely it was, because we calculate that. And the FDA in an early pre-submission meeting actually requested that be removed because they wanted the very simple binary answer given to patients. And so I think what's important as well is, in our case, and I think a lot of these cases, people are not using these independently apart from medical professionals. And I think medical professionals understand the nuance of false positive and false negatives. And so I think it's important that we're not trying to completely blow up and have people administer their own healthcare with these tools. We're basically trying to give them a tool that essentially helps a doctor more conveniently assess you in a virtual context. And so I think a lot of that complex nuance around what exactly this means gets addressed when you do have somebody who is trained in the mix.
And Arna, you had said before also that the consumer trend for a while of full body MRIs at your local shopping mall was a cautionary tale about potentially offering too much power to consumers that really they in the medical system weren't prepared to absorb. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I don't know if people remember, but 10, 15 years ago, there was this chain of self-paid MRIs that you could go and essentially get a full, or maybe I remember if it was MRIs or CAT scans or what it was, but some sort of full body scan where you could go and basically pay out of pocket and get a whole scan. And it actually resulted in so many false positives in terms of like seeing like a little something in the body that really was nothing, that it ended up being more detrimental than not, because people were having essentially biopsies and other surgeries for these things that were nothing, that never ever would have been picked up if they hadn't proactively gone and paid for that scan. So you do have to be careful to make sure that you provide people with the tool to understand what it is that the result that they're receiving.
I think one of the things we've seen with with a number of things that are either could be used by clinicians in a clinical setting, or potentially also used by patients at home, is that the FDA certainly has a higher bar for things that are used by patients in the home than by trained clinicians in many circumstances, right? So both in terms of how usable it is and the needs for human factors, but then also, what how those results are displayed, because again, you're not dealing with someone who has the training either to administer it in the way of a traditional test, or interpreting the results.
So we got some questions starting to come in. We'll jump over that. First one was really, somebody asked about business models. Who pays for this? How do you get paid? Is this a pay per press the button? Like every time, if I had that ear infection check, first of all, the business model for me would have been clear, which was take a percentage of the income I gain from not having to run my kids back and forth to the doctor to check for the ear infection or croup. That alone would be a unicorn proposition. But kind of, how does this get funded? Who benefits, or what are some of the interesting nuances? Because this is not incremental. This is sort of revolutionary in many ways.
Yeah, so we have a number of business models that we apply in different parts of the world and different use cases. So in some instances, it may be a fee per test, and that fee per test might be paid by an individual, like in private payer markets in a lot of the developing world, and they're obviously fairly low cost payments. You have pay per tests the payers may be interested in. And then, with telehealth providers directly that we work quite a lot with, they're often subscription models. So a set monthly fee for a set volume that would be a tiered model, are kind of the models we tend to take to market. And then we're doing a lot of work currently from a reimbursement perspective, just to understand exactly what payers are looking for and how we can best have these products reimbursed in lots of different markets around the world.
Any particularly interesting conversations or possibilities you think are out there this is opening up?
We're not short on interesting conversations. I think, again, and Anna speaks to this a lot, is, from a design perspective, thinking about who your end user of the product is and who's actually going to be paying for it is critical through that design process and having that kind of end in mind. But, as tech companies, we don't kind of always do that. And certainly we're probably less au fait with human-centered design than certainly Anna is. So, what we've had to do is have lots of conversations to try and help us understand, where's the value and who is receiving value in the system, and are they actually willing to pay for that value that is being attributed to the system, or do we have to find some other payment method there? It's not always straightforward. We found we've needed to do a lot of problem solving on the fly in this kind of launch period of time, but we are finding innovators who are willing to pay out of pocket themselves ahead of getting reimbursement. Probably the other plug that I'd also give is, think a little bit more broadly around this. I mean, I now work for the world's largest pharmaceutical company, but I'm also talking to lots of pharmaceutical companies about using our technology in clinical trials to find digital biomarkers to help as endpoints in clinical trials that also then become enablers of decentralized clinical trials and provides more real world evidence, as we've kind of spoken about. So there are a number of different payers that you can look at, not just traditional payers.
And I would say another one in that space is potentially as companion apps to particular drugs for screening as well. So not just during trials, but actually commercially. And then, one of the potential benefits there is, especially for, you know, things that people don't necessarily have great awareness over, is that you could get lift on sales as a pharma firm for your drugs, and that can be potentially a measurable outcome as well. So, not directly reimbursed in that case, but certainly value created, probably for both the patient in terms of earlier detection, diagnosis, and earlier treatment, and then revenue for the pharma firm.
And sorry, just to build on that one briefly, it's also worth thinking, in that companion app, are you actually enhancing then the value proposition of the pharma company to take to a payer? So they may actually be able to justify a higher price because of the value add of the digital side of things.
Because they can measure outcomes potentially, et cetera, as well. Right, exactly. So in terms of the actual, as we move more and more towards value-based, even in pharma, that's potentially very powerful.
So is there sort of an element that, okay, so maybe it'll actually result in some cases in fewer people getting the drug because this digital biomarker will be able to tell, but you can be happy because the people who are getting it are the people who really need it. So therefore it's better.
Yeah, it could be an aspect of helping to identify who actually needs the medication, right medication to the right patient at the right time. And, particularly in some other disease states, if you think about disease states like COPD or heart failure, where you have a pattern of patients exacerbating, base level of disease, but they get more sick at certain points in time. And, obviously the nirvana would be, could you avoid hospitalizations for more serious exacerbations? Is obviously a really significant payer value that you may be able to work on with a potential treatment.
Could you charge more for an antibiotic if you could guarantee that it's actually a bacterial infection and not a virus that you can't treat with it?
Antibiotics might be tough because of the pricing of them, but they're
right.
The thinking is right. It's just what's the right medicines that actually require that. But yes, that direction of thinking.
Randy, I had a question. Sorry, go ahead, Arna. I'll save my question.
No, I just wanted to comment on how interesting this topic of business models for CDCE is, because when we first started off a number of years ago, we actually had to do a whole bunch of market research, both with consumers and with providers, to understand even what the mental model is that people bring, because there are no medical diagnostics that you pay for on a cell phone. And so really understanding what this is like so that you can price it properly was really important. It's not really like an app, it turns out, but it's not really a medical device that you have to pay for up front. And so how you actually pay for it gives a number of opportunities, which is pretty unique in the space. Like the ability to pay for a medical device just when you need it is fairly unique at scale. There are some cases where you have subscriptions to devices, but that's relatively small. So I think it is really interesting that, as Mike was saying, there's a number of different business models that they're exploring, because we are still at the infancy of this disease. And I will say that a lot of people go immediately to, well, reimbursement, CPT codes, but in many ways, I think that is a bit of a red flag with diagnostics, because what we enable at scale is so different. Or a red herring, excuse me. It's a bit of a red herring for digital diagnostics, because what we're enabling at scale is something that has never been possible before. And there are levels of value that we pull from that we haven't had access to before. So, the values in terms of, all the ACOs interested in more efficient care delivery, I think, the convenience and the immediacy of access to care, the increased utilization of virtual care to help providers manage staffing shortages and control their clinic costs. I mean, all of these are pockets of value and budgets that I think have never really been accessible by a medical device before, but are accessible now.
You also,
I think there's one thing that's really important here to think about as well, which is, while distribution, there's 3 billion, 6 billion, however many cell phones out there, you still have customer acquisition or user acquisition costs, right? And so those aren't things that magically also build it and they will come, right? You have to think about those things as well. And so are you going it alone? Or are you leveraging, platforms like Dr. Mina's, or all of the above, right? In terms of how you're going to go to market or to get to people. The good news is all of these kinds of platforms and different things are, slowly but surely, growing. And so I think we're going to have more opportunities around that. I have one question around that, which is for Dr. Mina. You're building your own, but you're also evaluating, digital tools from other folks. How do you evaluate those, and what, if someone were going to look to integrate with your platforms, what are you looking for? What's good, and what does that integration look like?
The biggest thing that we're looking for, obviously, I think the biology underlying it needs to be there first and foremost. And by that, I mean the way that the electronics are interacting with the biology to perform the function. But, as a company, what we're really looking for when we are integrating, we started with these rapid tests, whether it's Binex now or a number of other large companies developing rapid tests across a number of different ailments. And digital diagnostics, we're looking for devices that might not necessarily have a home sitting completely on their own. What eMed is really good at is taking something that would kind of like, if you have an app that sits completely on its own and it's unconnected, very few people want to just pop into an app just to know. We found that during the pandemic, there's a lot of excitement to sort of, if you will, test to know at the beginning of the pandemic. As the pandemic moved on, the average person, I'm using the pandemic time window because that's kind of when most people started even talking about diagnostics at home. The average lay user started thinking about it. As time has moved on, it's become increasingly clear that people want action behind their tests. So the way that, because eMed is a company that really is a platform company that's able to tie in all different test manufacturers, whether they be physical or digital, into this sort of pipeline and platform that links people directly to healthcare and virtual care and treatment delivery options and such for therapeutics. It's imperative to us to try to find, on the one hand, orthogonal companies that we're not going to be creating channel conflict within our own kind of company, if you will, but also to find the companies that, are also, that are really focused on what they do well, which is oftentimes like digital diagnostics, building the tool itself, and maybe aren't experts in getting it out to the people and finding, creating an ecosystem where somebody actually wants to buy into it. So, just in this call, we have a number of companies, and either one of any of them might be billion-dollar product once wrapped up into a larger ecosystem that a person becomes a part of. It's like you wouldn't drive to the urgent care just to get your stethoscope put on your heart and then drive to another urgent care to get somebody to look in your ear. You just wouldn't do that. The good thing is virtual diagnostics, virtual care can bring it in really well. And I think the diagnostic companies like ResApp and Wavely here, they focus really tightly on what they're very, very good at. And we're trying to kind of be Switzerland and pick from the best of them and say, how do we make partnerships that are going to be economically advantageous to the companies, and also are going to really, my personal interest is drive forward innovation in healthcare. I'm not the business guy at eMed. I'm much more, focused on how do we just change the whole ecosystem of healthcare. And I think this panel alone, represents what we're going to see as becoming commonplace 10 years from now.
As you talk about the idea of go one urgent care center for the stethoscope and another for the tongue depressor, I think everybody on this call probably started thinking about, am I going to have if my phone is a Swiss Army knife for diagnostics, it can do 36 diagnostics. is that 36 apps with 36 accounts, 36 user interfaces. So if you're looking at a scale question or rolling up, then let's talk a little bit about who can compete at that, because it's not just pharma device. It seems like there's a lot of different companies. I mean, Google just bought a player in this space. So could you all talk about kind of who you see as the big kids who you think are eyeing this space and all the startups going on doing stuff?
Well, certainly Pfizer is one of them. You know, Roche, I think Roche is putting $10 billion or something into digital diagnostics. Thermo Fisher, you know, it's the big conglomerate, you know, that are really good at acquiring companies. And I think that's probably where a lot of the startups in the space are looking towards. And it's also, you know, those are the traditional players, but we're going to see Amazon, we're going to see Google, we'll see Facebook. Who knows? We'll see Twitter. You know, I had a conversation on Twitter about rapid tests with Elon Musk at one point during the pandemic. You know, they're like, you never know where these companies are going to go. They have so much money. And I think healthcare and biotech is, you know, coming from Boston, you know, up until a few months ago, biotech is easily, you know, the next software. It's the next, you know, big versioning place where you're going to see trillion-dollar companies. And I think all of them are clamoring right now just to figure out where are the nuggets, where is this world going, and where is the technology really most mature, and where does it have the most potential? But it's going to be you know, I think there will definitely be some new players that come out of left field and become, you know, 20 billion, $30 billion companies. But I think it's also going to be the 200+ billion dollar companies that rule the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think Michael's right in the aggregation that's going to happen. You know, it makes sense to have multiple of these diagnostics on a common core. And just as we've looked at the space, we essentially think there are 5 sectors that are likely to drive that aggregation. And I think the jury's still out which one it's going to end up being, but I think pharma is obviously one, with the, you know, a recent ResApp acquisition and the investments that Michael alluded to. I think big tech, you know, Google's acquired 2 of the digital diagnostic companies kind of quietly in recent times. I think Amazon, Apple, like it kind of makes sense that they would be eyeing the space. I think kind of the telehealth or digital health platforms is a potential player as well. You know, like imagine, you know, Teladoc, that's kind of the largest telehealth platform out there, and wanting to add functionality to their platform. I think number 4 is potentially a medical device company like a J&J that wants to stay relevant and expand business. And I think number 5 is this could be a private equity play as well, with somebody who wants to build a new company and pull together in the way, you know, that Nant Health was formed a number of years ago.
I've got another one that I think I agree with you, but I think there's another area that, you know, I'm really interested in seeing over the next few years, right? There are, you know, consumer focused, really almost retail focused healthcare companies, right? When you go, they have a storefront that it looks like a spa and people go into it, and they are location. These folks are rolling out all over the place. And if they're really, you know, trying to cater to the consumer as opposed to a patient, I can see them looking to expand into these areas as well, things that are complementary to their retail strategy as well.
What about like an Optum or a Change Healthcare?
They will certainly be interested. We currently work with Optum, and they're very, very interested in you know, they have some of the most to gain. You know, the covered entities. I mean, the covering entities. You know, they have the most to gain in some ways. You know, to make healthcare more efficient. But the one piece I was going to say as well is, although these are on consumer electronics, it would be naive to think that this isn't, when anyone walks into the most advanced hospital in the world right now, this is often the most advanced tool in the room. Doesn't matter where you are. And all of these diagnostic tools that are going to be made, I think, you know, we're still using almost all the doctor's tools of today are still based almost entirely around an average, you know, not just like an average doctor's medical training, and then the tools that were developed generally hundreds of years ago. And I think there's going to be a massive market for all of these tools that are being developed. You will see, I think, that the whole physical exam that a doctor or nurse does when a patient walks into a doctor's office is going to move to digital diagnostics on consumer electronics, I think, in a way that's already happening. We see stethoscopes being built with AI readers that are going into smartphones. So it's already happening, and I think that's going to be one of the major industries where we see this, because the reimbursements will almost necessarily be higher, and there's the newer generations of physicians are going to look more and more towards technology to be an assist, as the routine physical exam, is really kind of deprioritized, fortunately or unfortunately.
Yeah. Sorry,
I
just
had-
another dimension I
Go
was
ahead.
just mention is probably too, like, because we're speaking about smartphones a lot too, and who might play more on the aggregation of software and things. There's also more than that kind of Internet of Things dimension of what devices around me might be passively listening and engaging with me to understand my current health status, that might then, cause to have another kind of interaction with a smartphone or a person or whatever. So, it's the car that I'm driving as I'm going to work, it's the refrigerator that I walk past, or, my Bluetooth speaker that I'm listening to can in the background be detecting things and flag to me that, things aren't quite right. So, there's people, and some of the players we've already mentioned already have those kind of physical devices that could listen or observe people. But also, I think Dr. Mina's point too, that, someone's going to come out the blue here too, and there'll be a new version of Uber or Apple or whatever it is that could well be the major player 10, 20 years from now.
That reminds me of another thing which is it could be other data that is maybe, tied to data that you're getting. So for example, for certain diseases, there are environmental triggers. If you have location information off of the smartphone, you could potentially tie that to some of the environmental triggers, weather, pollution, et cetera, or even eventually indoor air quality, which are not things off of your device, but there are sensors somewhere that you're pulling that data in as well that could, have augment the diagnostics or be or alerts on those types of things.
So differentiate between diagnostics that are purely only out of the box in your bundled smartphone, iWatch, smart speaker, as opposed to extenders in the Internet of Things.
Yeah, you may be able to combine lots of different data sources in some cases, and I would imagine that if you are aggregating a lot of those things, you're probably pulling lots of different data sets. One of the advantages of having this complementary suite is the ability to do those types of things.
There's a fascinating in the flow of life diagnostic and monitoring company. So it came out of the University of Rochester. Basically, my understanding is the person, and this is now commercialized, but the person's doctoral dissertation was the question of, could you do all the heart monitoring you need if you baked all those sensors into a toilet seat? Because you really can't get much more in the flow of life than that. People got to go there at some point. So we have a question here from a guy in a clown outfit who says he's the managing partner of Burger King Diagnostics. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't be totally surprised, but a couple people said to come back to earth, like, okay, folks, regulatorily, like, if you upgrade your smartphone, does that invalidate the device? And is this software as a medical device? Is it software in a medical device? Like, what are the brass tacks of actually getting this stuff approved and proving that it's stable?
I can tackle it unless someone else wants to. So, the software as a medical device, in theory, means that it is not reliant other proprietary hardware or as part of that, right? So a mobile app could be both software as a medical device in some cases where a lot of what we're talking about here really is software as a medical device, or it could be software in a medical device. So if you are taking the picture front with a smartphone camera of, I don't know, the back of someone's throat, and then using that to feed into an AI algorithm to determine whether they have strep or COVID, that's software as a medical device. If you have a mobile app that connects into a physical device, some kind of a lateral flow assay, and just pulls the raw image in, and the AI algorithm uses that raw image in order to feed into an algorithm. It's software in a medical device because the medical device is both of those things together. It gets a little complicated if you could receive data from multiple different ones or other things, then maybe it becomes SAMD again. But those are the constructs that the IMDRF and FDA have put together to try to sort of, make it a little bit easier to deal with things that are purely software. But honestly, I think this stuff ends up blending together. As far as the question of how you deal with change to smartphones, well, that is one of the big issues. Most of the time, part of your submission process, if it is something that is that you end up submitting for regulatory clearance, you want your strategy for how you are testing on different device profiles, both during your development process, but then when you're out in the market as well. And that's kind of part of the process. You want to agree with the FDA or EU, et cetera, or your notified bodies. This is your testing process around that. And obviously, the more risk there is in those parts of it, the more rigorous you're going to have to be about that testing process.
And
Sorry, go, Dr. Mina.
I'm just reading one of the questions, very related, but how do you keep up with the dizzying array of new devices? If it's software in or as a medical device, how do you keep up with the technology? And I think we're seeing the struggles of that in the sort of more traditional diagnostic space right now. How are these test manufacturers, as an example, keeping up with all the variants of COVID? This is going to be a continuous. I think one of the more difficult questions that the agency and regulators around the world are going to have to consider is how do you limit where these tools can go, if that's going to ultimately limit what part of the population can actually have access. Are they going to have to start regulating how the app stores themselves are distributing the apps, for example, whatever it might be. But I think that across a whole array of different areas, as diagnostics become, it's almost like the diagnostics are trying to keep up with both biology and a massively accelerating network of devices. It's going to be one of the real challenges over the coming years to figure out how to retool the system. The Valid Act, which again, was kind of kicked down the road, is aiming to address some of these. So Congress is trying to push new approaches within the agencies to really address how do we keep innovation? How do we not stifle innovation because of just the massive number of different devices that are out there? And those are some of the pieces that are being currently really pondered by the agency.
Yeah, and the agency is very fluid right now. I mean, I think 3 to 4 years ago, when companies were first starting to talk to the FDA, and I probably the European agencies as well, though I'm not as familiar, but there was this point of view that, well, you're going to have to test model by model. The iPhone 12 may not work the same as the iPhone 11. And I think what a lot of companies have found is that actually iPhone 12 to iPhone 11 doesn't matter, because the same iPhone 11, like if you've dropped your phone and your toddler has chewed on your phone, which happens in our demographic, or, anything like that, phone is going to be different than the other iPhone 11. So it's really phone to phone that you have to have an equalization or calibration process to make sure. And really what the FDA is regulating is that calibration equalization process. And so then that allows you to expand to all phones. And then, most of the, like pretty much all of these companies at this point have built clinically validated anatomical models that essentially allow you to test your device on that phone when you make changes or there are software updates or whatnot, so that you don't have to go back into clinical trials. So I think it is a highly, as Dr. Minna said, a highly fluid and evolving space. And we've already just in the last year seen some pretty significant changes in the way that the FDA is thinking about diagnostics on a consumer electronics platform.
I think you're right. The more they see patterns and the more there are things that are out there, it's like, oh yeah, I don't need to worry about that, the better. I remember very early on when there was one of the first mobile apps connected to a glucose monitor. And the FDA filing, one of the things they wanted to make sure they had to do an additional study on was, can someone find the App Store and download the app? So they had to do, a human factors study on that to prove that could happen. No one asks for that anymore, but that's certainly, 2012, 2014, et cetera, those were the questions that were being asked. We'll have new questions that will get asked as we continue to sort of push what's possible.
Mike, could you share a little bit on the perspective of other countries? I've recently been made aware that there are other countries in the world besides the United States. I haven't proven it yet, but.
Yeah, so I can confirm there are other countries in the world. I live in one called Australia, and the TGA, the regulator there, it's probably fairly similar in many ways to what you would see in the European regulator with the CE mark, and we have achieved both of those on all three products. We have agreed processes to manage all of that with the regulators to build confidence that, firstly, the data that we've seen on the phone used in a clinical trial will actually transfer across into real world settings on other phone models. So we have models, et cetera, that we can use to demonstrate to that the regulators agreed on. And then similarly, we've been in market now for probably about 2.5 years. So we've certainly seen upgrades to the iOS system, the Android system, new handsets come in. So again, we have agreed processes for how we can validate that, firstly to make sure we're comfortable and confident that our software is working as intended and giving results as intended. And then, of course, you go into areas like post-market surveillance, et cetera, and all those sorts of areas where you're building the body of evidence to make sure that you've got a robust system and you're very, very confident in what you're doing. And, pretty important, Anna's diagnosing earaches, and Dr. Mina's working in COVID and in other areas where, the diagnosis leads to a treatment decision. So, someone is going to get a treatment when you come up with a positive diagnostic, most likely. And similarly, we're working in disease states like pneumonia, where, it's really critical that the diagnosis is accurate and very timely because you need to initiate treatment rapidly. So, I think you need to be confident yourself as a company and be able to demonstrate that to the relevant regulators.
Could you put a lens on that in terms of global public health in developing countries where it may not be, can this smartphone test replace a CLIA certified laboratory, but no test versus a midwife on a motorcycle?
Yeah. And our testing is all an aid to the diagnosis. It's not a binary outcome that is saying a patient definitively has pneumonia or not. We're an aid to the diagnosis that pneumonia may be indicated. And that result goes to a healthcare professional. And a healthcare professional has a different definition in each country that you're operating in. So you need to be clear about that. We see a lot of benefit potentially in the developing world for technologies like us and what Anna and Dr. Mina are working on to provide scale, as you're saying, to, you know, a healthcare worker who's sitting on a motorbike and jumping from town to town versus, you know, someone that can go, you know, walk around the corner and next minute you're in the Cleveland Clinic. So, you know, we do see the diagnostic insights having enormous values in these kind of low resource settings. And partly it's the quality of the insights and partly it's the ability just to scale it.
We're almost out of time. I want to apologize to people who submitted some questions, some of which are really good, but incredibly specific. What I'll tell all of you is this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. I may be, if we all say thank you to the speakers, maybe we could ask them to come back and we'll really go techie and more detailed on some of these topics, which sometimes we do. Also, please go out and spread the expression CDCE. I really would like to. I once tried to rename the tollway near me in Chicago the Beyonce, and that did not stick, but I think this may have a better shot. But maybe thank you to all of our speakers. You all have been tremendous. It's really awe-inspiring. Could you each in 20 seconds, what if people who are the remaining people, it's about actually about half the people stayed on this point, only take away one thing. What's the one point you each want them to take away? So let's start with Mike Connell.
I think the point I'd take away is there is enormous scope here to bring health insights to people when they need it the most, no matter where they are on Earth.
Dr. Manna.
I would say, I mean, certainly the scope is first and foremost, but you know, I think as we look towards the future of healthcare and these types of tools and diagnostics, I would you know, urge everyone to, like, you know, the one big takeaway for me is to not just try to replicate what we've done already as physicians and healthcare professionals and tools that have already been developed, trying to push them into these devices. But, you know, these devices open up a whole world of an entirely new ecosystem. And I think that's where we're going to see the biggest change is when people come up with entirely new approaches that, you know, just aren't in the current lexicon of physicians or the healthcare system.
All right. Bernhard? You're on mute. It's less memorable.
I'm as excited as all of you guys are about the potential for this. I think, you know, to some people, this is also scary because it is different. I would say that, you know, we're coming up with better and better regulatory and quality answers around software and how much software change there is. So there is a lot of stuff being developed around those things, around cloud computing, around sort of the concept of predetermined change control plans, et cetera, that the FDA, I think, is trying to move out of just AI into other areas. So, you know, as you keep going on this, I think there are tools that make the regulatory landscape a little bit easier to deal with than you might think. It's not that you are way out somewhere where no one is actually paying attention to you. This is a really big focus for regulators. They understand that and are also excited about the future here and are trying to come up with ways of enabling people to do things quickly and safely.
And Arna, before I ask you to bring it home, I just want to thank you because you've really been our sage in our journey into CDCE. And I think someday you will be remembered not just for Wavely and what you do with your own device, but for the role you're playing here and really kind of building a community around this and making it a thing, because there's certain tragedy that comes problems that are going to have to be collectively solved. So with that, bring us home and we'll close out with your one takeaway we should not forget.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think that healthcare has been in need of a change for a very long time, but we have been limited by the tools that we have. And I think that fundamentally being able to have medical devices, medical diagnostics, physical exams immediately accessible at scale is basically that technological foundation that has the potential to truly shift and make healthcare into basically a system that works as opposed to a system that doesn't work very well today.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Everybody else, we will reconvene and answer other questions, and please send us your feedback and your suggestions. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.